Hello everyone, and welcome to a new segment on Our Own Devices I'm calling Real Engineering, in which we'll be looking at movies and TV shows with surprisingly good, and laughably bad, depictions of engineering. And to start this series, we're going back to the movie that kicked off the James Bond phenomenon, the 1962 classic, Dr. No. In case you haven't seen it, a quick recap. Bond is sent to Jamaica to investigate the mysterious disappearance of fellow MI6 agent Commander Strangways. He soon discovers that Strangways was investigating a certain Dr. No, a mysterious Chinese scientist who operates out of the heavily guarded island of Crab Key. After fending off various assassination attempts by Dr. No's henchmen, Bond infiltrates Crab Key and discovers that Dr. No, an agent of the international criminal organization Spectre, is using a nuclear-powered radio transmission to send US missile launches off course. Bond is subsequently captured, has dinner with Dr. No, is tortured and imprisoned, escapes, drowns Dr. No in his own reactor, overloads said reactor, and along with Bond girl Honey Rider, escapes the exploding island just in time. The end. As the first entry in the series, Dr. No lacks many of the conventions we've come to expect of Bond films, and some parts of it can come off as downright weird. But it's a classic for a reason, having many iconic moments, a fun, exuberant pace, and a magnetic performance by Sean Connery that still make it a worthwhile watch today. The engineering issues with the film come from its depiction of nuclear physics. What tips off Bond, and Strangways before him, that something suspicious is going on at Crab Key is that the island is heavily contaminated with radioactivity. Indeed, when Bond and Honey are captured by Dr. No's henchmen, they're subjected to an extensive decontamination procedure to clean off the radioactivity they picked up in the island's swamps. But what the film never explains is just why the island is so contaminated. Is Dr. No dumping contaminated coolant, or disposing of spent reactor fuel in the swamp? If so, why? There are much easier ways of handling radioactive waste that are far less likely to attract outside attention. But whatever the case, the decontamination procedure shown on screen is actually one of the best in cinema. Radioactive contamination, such as the fallout from a nuclear explosion or a reactor meltdown, typically takes the form of fine dust, dirt, mud, or other small particles containing radioisotopes that can easily become stuck to a person's clothes or skin. Thus, provided Bond and Honey didn't swallow or breathe in too much of this contamination, most of it can easily be removed with a thorough scrubbing with soap and hot water. A nice detail is Dr. No's henchmen pointing out that some contamination could be hiding under Bond's fingernails, and making him use a special hand radiation scanner just to make sure. While the conveyor belt decontamination shower is unnecessarily elaborate, Bond and Honey could easily have been decontaminated standing still. Overall, this is a surprisingly accurate scene. However, things start to get dubious again once we actually get to Dr. No's reactor setup. The good doctor appears to be using what's known as a pool-type or swimming pool reactor, in which the core is immersed in an open pool of water that acts as the moderator, coolant, and shielding all in one. While at first glance this might seem like a very dangerous setup, at the relatively low power level such reactors are designed to operate at, say around 250 kilowatts, only a few feet of water are sufficient to block all neutron radiation emitted by the core, allowing people to safely work at the edge of the pool without any protection. Pool-type reactors are also designed with what's known as a negative thermal coefficient of reactivity, meaning that as the core gets hotter, its reactivity actually decreases, making the reactor self-regulating and impossible to melt down. Indeed, Edward Teller, the designer of the popular TRIGA reactor, boasted that it could be given to a bunch of high school children to play with without any fear that they would get hurt. For this reason, pool-type reactors are commonly used by universities to teach nuclear physics and engineering, to train power plant operators, and as neutron sources for physics experiments. But unfortunately for our villain's plans, the one thing pool-type reactors can't do is generate electricity. Nuclear power plants operate much like regular oil or coal-fired plants in that they use a source of heat to convert water into steam, which is then passed through a turbine to generate electricity. The only difference is that in a nuclear power plant, the heat source is not burning fuel, but a nuclear chain reaction. There are two main ways of doing this. In a pressurized water reactor, or PWR, there are two coolant loops, a primary and a secondary. The primary coolant loop is sealed and actually runs through the reactor core where it absorbs the heat of the nuclear reaction. The coolant is kept under high pressure, around 158 atmospheres, to prevent it from boiling, allowing it to efficiently carry the reaction heat away to a heat exchanger. Here the heat is transferred to a secondary loop in which the water is allowed to boil and produce steam for the generator turbines. The advantage of this system is that the primary coolant loop, the only one in direct contact with the reactor core, is relatively small and sealed, limiting the number of components exposed to radioactive contamination. In the other common power reactor design, the boiling water reactor or BWR, coolant is boiled in the core itself and the resulting steam passed directly through the turbines. While simpler than the PWR, the system exposes the whole cooling and turbine system to contamination, making it harder to maintain and decommission. In both cases, however, there is no need to dump any radioactive coolant, making the extensive contamination of Crab Key inexplicable. Conversely, one of the major safety advantages of pool-type reactors is that they operate at ambient pressure, making it impossible for them to build up steam pressure and suffer dangerous ruptures or explosions. Unfortunately, this lack of pressurization ability also makes it impossible for them to generate steam and thus electricity. And even if Dr. No somehow managed to hotwire his pool reactor with a pressurized coolant loop, at the power levels needed to generate a usable amount of electricity, the core would likely be emitting a greater neutron flux than a few feet of water could stop, exposing himself and his men to deadly levels of radiation. And before you write in the comments that they're all wearing radiation suits, these appear not to be lead-lined suits for protection against direct radiation exposure, but rather positive pressure suits that only protect the wearer from breathing in radioactive particles. The inherent safety of pool-type reactors also works against the film's climax, as the negative thermal coefficient of reactivity would make it impossible for Bond to overload the reactor, much less cause the pool to boil and the core to explode. But if we give Dr. No the benefit of the doubt and assume that somehow he bypassed all the reactor's safety features, then there is one possible explanation for why the layer explodes as it does. Nuclear fuel elements are typically encased in a metal called zircaloy, which is transparent to neutrons and doesn't interfere with the nuclear chain reaction. At high temperatures, however, zircaloy reacts with water to produce hydrogen gas, which if not adequately vented can build up and ignite. Indeed, this is one of the causes of the Fukushima disaster. When the earthquake and tsunami cut off mains and emergency electric power to the coolant pumps, spent nuclear fuel stored in cooling ponds on site overheated, generating hydrogen which eventually ignited and destroyed the storage buildings. But given the volume of Dr. No's lair compared to the small size of the reactor, it probably would have taken hours for the core to generate enough hydrogen to level the building. And all this would have required the good doctor to make so many modifications and workarounds to his pool reactor that he would have been better off installing a regular old PWR or BWR instead. For being a self-proclaimed expert in nuclear physics, Dr. No sure has terrible taste in reactors. Maybe Spectre got it on clearance. Of course, we all know the real reason for Dr. No using a pool-type reactor, because it looks really cool. Production designer Ken Adam, the man who practically invented the elaborate supervillain lair, likely realized that regular power reactors, with their working parts hidden inside a containment vessel, are rather mundane looking, and opted instead for a more dynamic open design where the audience could see the core glowing and the control rods moving. This setup also allows Bond to drown Dr. No in his own reactor, a much more satisfying showdown in the original book where Bond buries the villain under a mound of guano. For this reason, I'm willing to give Dr. No's choice of reactor a pass, as it's an excellent example of artistic license used in the service of visual storytelling. As an aside, the rocket launch Dr. No is attempting to disrupt with his radio beam also doesn't make much sense. The mission is described in the film as an attempt to orbit a probe around the moon, which given the year the film was released would make it one of the Ranger missions. However, all the Ranger probes were launched aboard Atlas Agena rockets, while the rocket shown on the TV monitors appears to be a Titan I ballistic missile. Stranger still, the mission control chatter heard over the launch refers to the mission as Mercury, the name of the US manned space program at the time. Well, that's all I have for you today. Please let me know if you like this new segment, and feel free to suggest other movies I should cover in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you next time on Our Own Devices.